Okay, everyone. Well, welcome tonight. We are thrilled to have you for this third Friday lecture from our very own William Derrah on the Northwest Ordinance. Hooray, hooray. Couple of little housekeeping things before we get started. For those who are joining at home, hello and welcome. We're happy to have you. If you have any questions during the talk, please put your questions in the Q&A tab. We'll be sure to get to those. For those at home and here in person, next month in March for Third Friday, we'll have Chris Habermal, the CBS traffic reporter, doing a talk on, his relationship to the waterways, seeing them from the sky. But tonight I have the distinct pleasure of introducing William Derrah to all of you. Now, William Derrah is a Chicago Maritime Museum board member and historian. He joined the Chicago Maritime Society as a volunteer more than a decade ago to help the museum's burgeoning artifact collection. A University of Chicago geography major, Bill also holds a master's degree in history education, and more recently, he completed the University of Chicago's Artifact Collection Care Certification Program so that he could better address our collection needs. Bill is also a member of the Chicago Yacht Club's Island Goat Society, having sailed more than 25 Chicago to Mackinac races. And I can at least tell you all that if I have a question that even comes close to a canoe, he is the first person I'm emailing. So, without further ado, let's put our hands together for Bill Derrah.
Thank you, Madeline. A couple of weeks ago, Jim Jarecki said that the person who was scheduled for this couldn't make it and said, "Do you want to talk about something?" And I said, I've been kind of interested in the Northwest Ordinance. Like 40 years ago, I wrote a paper on the logging industry and it came up. And I'm like, it's something. Anyway, I foolishly said, yeah, I'll do it on this. So anyway, so here we go.
So sorry.
Am I not on?
I didn't unmute you on the thing. There. Oh. Okay. I'm sorry. All set.
Okay. Well, whoever didn't hear me before, sorry. So this topic also came up a few years ago when another board member, Mary Ann O'Rourke, wrote a really pissed off letter to the editor because one sailboat went through downtown Chicago at rush hour and all the bridges opened and it snarled traffic and it stopped the L and, she was outraged. And I'm like, well, the fact is that the boats have some precedents and that there's a bit of legislation that got us into the union. And part of that had us this little bit, Article 4. The navigable waters leading into the Mississippi and St. Lawrence and the carrying places between the same shall be common highways and forever free, as well to the inhabitants of the said territory as to the citizens of the United States and those of any other states that may be admitted into the Confederacy without tax, impost, or duty thereof, or therefore. So, and that's just one article in this Northwest Ordinance. But that was sort of what got me interested in looking at it a little more. Here we go. And it really is, if you look at the whole thing, it's how America invented itself. In 1789, there were 14 states because there were the 13 colonies and then Vermont. Which Vermont wasn't 100% sold on being with the United States. It was thinking about maybe being Canada and whatever. They're not that unlike that now. But anyway, they did eventually sign the Constitution. But anyway, through the Northwest Ordinance, by 1861, the states that had created the federal government were now outnumbered by the states that the federal government had created. So it's saying that the Northwest Ordinance was like the country's DNA, I mean, that's such an overused thing right now, but it really is. They looked at the process of becoming a state and they broke it down to steps. But there were a series of ordinances, and we'll look at that later. But so just keep that in mind. It's a process. So the other interesting thing is there are multiple ordinances, and the two that have the big, it's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and that was the last really big significant piece of legislation under the Articles of Confederation. And then, of course, the last big thing was that they passed the U.S. Constitution. And then when they re-met as the U.S. Congress under the new Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, which was almost identical, was one of the first things they passed. So you've got kind of, it's a different group creating the Northwest Ordinance than were on the committee that created the Constitution, but they were working in parallel, and there's a lot of overlap. And this comes in under the Articles of Confederation, and then it comes in identically. They pass it right away because it was so important to the creation of the country. So it's how the U.S. moves from 13 colonies to becoming the United States. It's got the mechanisms built into it. As it goes through, like the Ordinance of 1780 and the Ordinance of 1785, they're kind of working their way from the real aspirational sort of Declaration of Independence to creating a federal system, and they're coming up with a way of building the country, and the ordinances play a big role in that. They try to balance the sort of Jefferson populism that was very popular in the West from sort of a more interest in central authority, which was more popular in the East, where people had money and didn't want everybody to vote. So you'll see a lot of restrictions on who could vote and who can hold office, depending on how much property they owned. And those tended to get less further west. Another thing that they had to balance, the frontier, was an active frontier with Native Americans, but really the British were really kind of wreaking havoc through the Native Americans on the north. And then the Spanish controlled the area that we call the Louisiana Purchase and New Orleans to the west and south. And we'll get into that later, but it's kind of interesting. What tended to happen was that when people didn't like how things were going in we'll call it the Old Northwest, they left for the Spanish side of the Mississippi because it was perceived as being better. So it was fending off foreign foes, both as a negative, but also trying to improve it so other places didn't look more positive. It calls all the different ordinances mention that there are other people who happen to live on this land, and they stress that it should be, purchased and negotiated. Now, obviously, these last three things don't happen the way one would hope they do. There's a prohibition against slavery in the Northwest Territories. One of the earlier versions that Jefferson put out, I think it's a 1784. Let's see, do I have that? Anyway, it was not specifically, his ordinance wasn't just the Northwest Territories. It was a blanket, how we're going to increase the country. And he asked for no slavery in any new territories or new states. And that one provision got voted out by like 2 votes. And there were at least 3 people who were sick at the vote who would have voted for it. So we came so close to actually never having a civil war because slavery would have been confined to only the 13 colonies that already had it, and it never would have gone west. And then we've got freedom of navigation, which is a little bit I showed you, which is what started us on this, or me on this journey. Okay, so let's go to how it looked before 1759. We've got, let's see if I've got, so the people at home can see, we've got New France here. Colbert, who was Louis XIV's minister, eventually came up with this great idea to link. Okay, real quick, Joliet was sent to see what's the Mississippi doing? Is it going to get us to the Pacific or the Gulf? He got as far as Arkansas and realized we're going to the Gulf of Mexico. He came back. Later, Colbert and LaSalle, well, Colbert sent LaSalle to actually create a string of forts that would link the whole interior down the Mississippi and to New Orleans. And that way, the northern part of Canada, which was costing the French a ton of money to keep, could support down here we've got Haiti and a few of these islands, which are tiny, but the amount of sugar they produced was a vast amount of money. So the king was making a ton of dough on those little islands, and the rest of Canada was costing money. But one of the problems in maintaining this Caribbean empire was your ships had to get to fresh water to get taken care of. There's a thing called a shipworm, a teredo. It needs, if you can get it in fresh water, you can maintain it. The other thing is that the conditions that allow you to grow sugarcane, you can't grow food. So the idea was, as soon as Joliet and LaSalle went down, they realized that the area around Illinois would be absolutely great for farming. So they wanted this chain of forts. They were going to put farmers in Illinois, and they were going to supply New Orleans with food that would go to the islands, and it would be a shipyard for their navy. So now LaSalle dies, there's all sorts of things, but eventually that system sort of works itself out. And interestingly, Prairie du Rocher in southern Illinois, and there's Fort Maureen, that's right where you grew up, right? What's the big, anyway, it was the largest stone fort in North America. It was built right on the Mississippi. And you know, another like deep historical dive, the area around Cahokia, which the French settled hundreds of years ago, like the 1300s, that was possibly the largest city in the world. So, I mean, that's just where Monk's Mound is. Yeah, yeah. So that area it's really fertile. The French realized this and they started settling people there. And at the time of the American Revolution, there were French settlers who were growing wheat and they were sending it down to New Orleans. So that actually ended up happening. Let's see. So we've got the French and Indian War, which, and then these are some other sort of political events that are going to affect the Midwest or the old Northwest. So looking at the French and Indian War, it starts with a mishandled raid by the Virginia militia on Fort Duquesne, where 40 or so French soldiers are captured, and I think 14 or 15 of them are murdered after they've surrendered. And yes, and who was responsible for this? George Washington. So this officer in the Virginia militia actually starts the thing called the 7 Years' War. That was not, now he didn't pour the gasoline across everything, but he carelessly lit a match. So this really goes into this worldwide, war that goes across Europe, and the rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War. It also featured another thing called Braddock's Defeat, which interestingly, so Fort Duquesne is Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh's important because it's where the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together and the Ohio River is formed. So it is how you get to the interior if you're coming from the east. So that's what Washington was going to attack the French fort there. Braddock is a British general with, I don't know if it was 1,400 guys. And he's, by June of 55, during the 7 Years' War, he's going to go up and try to capture Fort Duquesne again. And he's led by the same guy who got us into the mess. And they walk into an ambush, and it is the largest defeat by percentage of people killed that the British probably suffered until the Zulu Wars. So I think it was something like 1,000 guys were killed of the 1,400. So it's a mess, and that also was George Washington. Anyway, but on the British elsewhere did well. They captured Quebec, a famous thing, which you could give a whole talk about the siege of Quebec, but that's not our. But that's extremely important because after Quebec falls, the French have to make a decision. Do they want to keep Quebec, which is costing them a ton of money, or they're offered a choice? They can keep their sugar islands in the Caribbean, or they can keep Quebec. And they, much to the dismay of all the Quebecois, they do not pick Quebec. So this is a little out of time, but we're going to look at it because this is what the colonies sort of imagined they owned. And this becomes an issue because a lot of these East Coast colonies, think they go at least as far as the Louisiana Purchase. So one of the things that all these ordinances do, they kind of starts out, and what's really interesting is, and we'll get to it, the ordinance of 1780, so the American Revolution is still being fought, and they come up with this ordinance, and it's one of the parts of it is eventually we're going to settle this, and everybody's going to give up their hinterland, and we're going to have new states. But they didn't have a mechanism, they didn't have it, but they had that collectively decided that they were going to sort this mess out. And also, if you think about it, let's see. So if, Fort Duquesne is up, I'm not getting this right, but, and Washington came with Virginia militia because Virginia figured that was part of their property, even though Pennsylvania thought it was their property. So, and Connecticut, right, they go all the way to Dubuque, Iowa, almost. Anyway, so and then this is interesting because this is how you got into the interior through the Cumberland Gap. So this would be easier, but that's what the French were doing. So you can't do that. And the other problem with the Great Lakes, and at times the French had to go all the way over through Lake Huron, go up the French River from Montreal across down into Lake Huron, because this lower Great Lakes, the Iroquois, if they didn't want you to go, if they were in a bad mood this year, you didn't want to go. So they were on again and off again. So that was an issue. So, and then, so access to the interior was difficult. The French and then later the Spanish controlled New Orleans. So that was a painful way to go. All right. So after the British take over, they decide the Native Americans are unhappy about the British taking over from the French, and the British are a lot cheaper. The French actually were, one of the reasons Quebec was expensive is they were subsidizing the fur trade to gain leverage with the tribes, and the British weren't as generous And, well, we had Pontiac's War, which was actually pretty brilliant. Their siege of Mackinac was just, it's like a movie. They send some people in to like casually trade, and they're sitting around, and then a bunch of young guys are playing lacrosse, and the ball goes over the wall of the fort. So we're all playing ball, and we're just going to run in after it, and they get inside the fort. So like something out of the Iliad. Anyway, so the British kind of freak out, and they withdraw, and they have this royal proclamation of 1763 to reduce, so this whole area is going to be Indian territory. And so all these states that had aspirations of getting on the other side of the Appalachians and Alleghenies are pissed. And there are some people have gone over already. There are people who, and there are a lot of sort of like the Ohio Land Company. They're trying to push settlement. So this is one of the things that help amongst many things that caused the American Revolution, and it has to do with the treatment of the Northwest Territories. So then we've got the American War of Independence as the next step. So this is sort of the flow. We've got the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation. And so the resolution on public lands, I mentioned that's the one that they, even though the war's on, they don't know if they're going to win. They've all decided they're going to figure it out later. And then, so the Land Ordinance of 1784, I think that's the one that Jefferson had the most input on. It increased who could vote. It reduced the qualifications for voting, but how much land you had. But there's still tension between people just going out and settling and the government, coming down and deciding how they were going to do it. The next step was the Land Ordinance of 1785, which was where they actually created a mechanism for selling land. That's the first time they decided on a plan to sell land, and they decided they needed a survey, so they knew how to sell the land. And then we've got our big ordinances of 87 and 89. So, and then later, these come in later, the Land Act of 96. The big thing there is they reduced the price per acre of land that you had, if you wanted to buy it from the government, to $2 an acre. Sounds like a deal now, huh? I think $2 went further in those days. The Harrison Land Act of 1800. Before, you had to buy at least 640 acres, which was a lot. So to try to allow people with less means, they reduced that to 320 acres, and they only required a 25% down payment, which was the first time that the government was ever willing to front, the land to people who would come up with a down payment. And then finally, what's interesting for our case here, by 1812, they had the Congressional Act of May of 1812, and that was an expansion of voting rights. And so by the time, the Illinois territory is looking at starting to vote in Illinois, they have the least barrier for voting and the least barrier for holding office. I think it's down to like 50 acres. So, and that's in response to demand out west for this, and again, fear of people going to the British side or something. The French were not an issue after 1800. So, all right. So anyway, we've talked about the resolution on public lands. When we were looking at designing museum exhibits, they said you can't have any block of print that's more than 60 words. Because people's eyes will glaze over and they'll walk by. And then afterwards they'll go, I had a terrible experience because they didn't read anything. So anyway, That's more than 60 words. And we covered the gist of it already. Okay, so frontier evolves, we did the American Revolution. It ends with the Treaty of Paris. And that's important because it defines this boundary with the British Empire. And here we go. And see, I can either look at the map there or put my glasses on and look at the map on my screen here. So here's sort of, this area is the Northwest Territories, and it's defined through this. Now, what's interesting is there's some up in Maine, stuff isn't really nailed down, and out west, it's not really nailed down. But this is what's agreed on, and there was a great map at the Newberry that I need to find that had that. So yeah. Now, a fun thing I found, when the British were negotiating, they had a couple of maps with them in Paris. And this Mitchell map of 1775 had the British giving away almost the whole, what's now the inhabited area of Canada, Eastern Canada. To make it a little more simple, where are we going here? There we go. That was one of the things they had. They had this map, and if negotiations required it, they would have rolled this into what they were going to offer the U.S. And you're like, well, why would they do that? Well, because Canada wasn't Canada then. It was a lot of wilderness, and it did have a lot of forest resources, which was a thing. But the other thing it had a ton of French Canadians. And when the French made the decision, do we want to give up Quebec or give up Haiti and Martinique? And the French minister wrote in a letter to another minister, he said, after we let go of Canada, let's see how long the 13 colonies stay with Britain. Because he knew that once the pressure of the French being right above them was off, that the colonies didn't need the British. And so the French had figured the American Revolution was a possibility when they made that decision. Now I'm thinking this map, the British were dropping a similar poison pill. If they had gone with this, one of the things they could be thinking is, we're going to dump this large foreign-speaking Catholic population on this Protestant New England country. Let's see how they like that. So anyway, that's all, as they say, counterfactual history, because this map was never used. And the map that was used, again, just to look at, these are sort of what the states were claiming. And then this is sort of what ended up after the American Revolution, what was settled on. Again, the lines are there. So Kentucky, which had people moving into it through the Cumberland Gap, had sort of a population that, so they were next in line for getting statehood pretty early. And it wasn't really the same process as the Northwest Ordinance process. Okay, and then that's again where we're at. So we're working our way, looking at how these are. So
how much should we read into that? The constitutional government ended in 2024.
Well, I think that the history of this period has not been written yet. I was wondering if anybody was going to catch that. So Article 6 in the Northwest Ordinance. Basically, so you don't have to read this over 60-word thing, no slavery in the Northwest Territories. Weirdly, in another earlier section, they write, one of the things, on your stepping stones, the way you're working towards becoming a state, you have to have 5,000 free male inhabitants. So why did they have this free when you weren't supposed to have any slaves? But the answer to that is they didn't know which pieces of the legislation were going to get passed. Because in an earlier ordinance where, the 1780 or 84, they had no slavery at all west, and that part got voted down. So that's probably why they have that split up. But anyway, interesting. No slavery. Well, how does that work? We've got Arthur St. Clair was the first official governor of the Northwest Territories. Now, there was a military commander who was pretty bad and corrupt, actually started a lot of people moving across the Mississippi into Missouri. I mean, St. Louis was actually a good sized town. And then, but anyway, so St. Clair replaces him. He's very federalist. He's very, I'm going to make the laws. And these people are Westerners and they tend to be a little more Jeffersonian free. He wasn't liked. He would kind of he'd pick and choose laws from out east and just impose them. There was no democratic voting on laws. And then, just weirdly, he didn't want to. So some people who had slaves did move across to Missouri, which was in Spanish territory, to keep their slaves. So partly that, and I don't know what other reasons, but he came up with excuses for people to keep their slaves. He decided that you could call it an indenture of a 99-year period. So if you live to be 120, you could retire free. So St. Clair, well, he'll come up in a little bit, but sort of an interesting story that anyone know who John Kinsey is? Kinsey Avenue and everything. He was sort of like, oh, our founding father and everything, but he was really not a good guy. He had to leave the East because, and there's different stories. In one story, the Americans think he's a British agent. Another story, the British think he's an American agent. He's definitely cheated a lot of people. So he's not a great guy. He's Canadian, but he starts trading here. A lot of indication he might be connected to the British. He's involved with the murder of, well, okay, it's not like he's suspected. He admits he murdered Lalime, and he ends up owning DuSable's property, which actually had been registered to Jean Lalime in Detroit. Oh, well. And he got his trade goods, and there was also, he had been accused of bribing $400 to an officer in order to get a sweetheart deal supplying Fort Dearborn. And there's another subtext that he was in contact with the British, and the British were actively trying to get the Native Americans to cause problems they were providing weapons. They were in large groups when there were battles. There were British who were behind the scenes officers who were with oops, go backwards here. So how does he get away with all this and become the big hero of Chicago? Well, after murdering Lalime, he runs away and he goes up to Milwaukee while the heat's on and hangs out with a band of British connected Indians. And within 2 months, there's this Fort Dearborn massacre and everybody's gone. So there's so much other stuff that happens. People kind of forgot the fact that he murdered somebody to get the property. He shows up after the war. His son marries this Juliet Augusta McGill Kinsey, and she writes a lot of books about what a wonderful guy he was. And that is how he rehabilitated himself. PR. Jim, is Marianne online to hear this?
Yes, she is.
All right. I thought of her during that. Yeah. Okay, so funny story that has to do with the ordinance here. So despite getting away with murder, his comeuppance, as it may, comes through the Northwest Ordinance. He just in brief, he's living in DuSable's old digs. He and his partner buy a slave, Jeffrey Nash. Nash decides this is not a good thing, and he goes down river. He ends up in New Orleans. He's living there for a while, has a family, and eventually the Kinsey clan finds out he's down there, and they start a legal proceeding to get him back. And so Kinsey and his brother-in-law or his half-brother Forsyth claimed that Nash was, not a free-born servant under indenture, but actually a slave. But the kicker is that the Louisiana Supreme Court looks at it and goes, well, this all happened in the Northwest, or in the old Northwest. There's no slavery there. So guess what? He's not a slave. So even though there's a fugitive slave law as part of it, so if he had been a slave in Louisiana and had gone up there, he would have been returned. But because he was a slave, so here we have a slave in Illinois who goes downriver to the south and is declared free, which is a little a different oops, jumped too many here. There we go. Okay, so good old St. Clair or Sinclair gets himself in trouble at the Battle of the Wabash. The gentleman here, I will not attempt his name. In English, they call him Little Turtle, but the actual translation is just Turtle. There's no diminutive little, but I guess after he does what he does, they want to make fun of him somehow because he, and here we're going to see where the battle is. It is, so the Miami Indians control this area. And this is, if you look at the river system, which is why I like this map, see this little thing that says St. Clair's defeat? Yeah, that's a preview. Anyway, the Miami control this, and that's, the Wabash is the longest navigable river between the Ohio and the Mississippi. It's a really important highway. And guess what? If you go up, you can go to the Maumee, which is of course a derivative of the Miami, and that gets you into the Great Lakes. So it's a really strategic place, and the Miami control it. And they're putting pressure with the British behind them, by the way. They're getting supplied by the British, and they're putting pressure on settlers. So St. Clair goes up to defeat them, and pretty much he suffers the largest defeat the American army has ever suffered as a percentage of the army. I think now, way smaller army. I mean, I forget what I think between 600 and 1,000 people died. 600 confirmed bodies. 1,000 people don't show up at roll call. Did they disappear in the wilderness? And that's what, about 12 minutes at Gettysburg. But at that time, this was that was the whole American army was wiped out. And Washington was apparently livid, which is kind of funny considering what he did. But anyway, so later they send Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony Wayne, and he comes up the Ohio and he builds a series of forts. And he goes, the Fort Defiance is right on the site. Soldiers said they had to actually move bones before they could set up their camp. And so he builds a fort there, and it's right on the banks of the Wabash. It's right in this territory. And then he takes on the Miami. And eventually, it's actually Miami and Shawnee together, and another tribe or two. Anyway, he finally does a fairly definitive battle at Fallen Timbers, and that ends that particular alliance. So back to our frontier evolving. We're going to look next at the Treaty of San Lorenzo, also called Pinckney's Treaty. And this was good because it took sort of some pressure off the western boundary of the Old Northwest. The Spanish agreed that Americans could go up and down the Mississippi and use the port of New Orleans. But this, it doesn't even last a decade before the French, through Napoleon's marriages, gets that Louisiana territory back and then sells it to the Americans. So, and then we'll go to the Jay Treaty. So, one of the things that, again, that's over our 60-word thing. So try not to get discouraged. But the British were doing lots of really awful stuff. And they've been doing this since the American Revolution. They were stopping American ships, stealing the stuff, kidnapping the sailors. I mean, they called it impressing seamen, but it's kidnapping. And on top of that, though, in the West, they were actually conspiring with disaffected tribes like Little Turtle and his group and the Shawnee, and they were supplying them arms and logistics and, really sort of creating a atmosphere of terrorism on the border. And for future U.S.-Indian relations, that probably caused it to be irreparably damaged, because the British using them to cause problems on the frontier meant that there was almost no way they were ever going to come to a peaceful arrangement after that. And I think before that it could have. So Detroit, Mackinac, Niagara, Oswego, and Miami were all British forts that were on U.S. territory that they were supposed to have vacated after the Treaty of Paris, and they didn't. So the British were actually occupying these sites, and they were using that to push their, interference in the American frontier. So the Jay Treaty addressed these holdouts. And interestingly, we're just about to jump into the War of 1812, and almost every one of these forts, the British immediately try to get back when that war starts. Now, again, just like we call the French and Indian, well, the 7 Years' War, we call it the French and Indian War, the War of 1812, you know what everybody else calls it? The Napoleonic Wars. That's what's really going on. We're the sideline. At least we didn't start at this time like we did the other one. So there's the War of 1812, and then there's the Convention of 1812, which sort of really starts, the boundary is not as much of a problem. But at the beginning of the Napoleonic conflict, that's where the Louisiana Purchase comes in, so now the Old Northwest that we're talking about suddenly becomes the middle of the country. Even though it's sort of an active settlement frontier, legally, the U.S. now goes, through the whole Missouri basin. So it changes, but the mechanisms for getting states admitted still follows the pattern that was developed in with the Northwest Ordinances. So kind of a fun thing, we were talking about the Jeffersons wanting to, a little freer, and the Federalists being a little more central control. So out on the frontier, it kind of plays out a bit. You've got towns where people are settling at this time, and they're picking names. And, from this, it would kind of look like it's a dead heat. But the tiebreaker, Marengo was one of Napoleon's big victories against the Austrians, and that's memorialized in a lot of towns. Normal is actually based on Napoleon's educational. Did you know? Yeah, Normal, right. And then there's one, Waterloo, I want to say. So but that just underlines that the West was fairly pro, liberal in its, not federalist, more Jeffersonian. And then the final treaty that's sort of ironing out stuff really starts off after there's this Canadian rebellion, and some of the Canadians go back to the US, and then the British send like a little hit squad to attack them. They've got a boat on the American side of the St. Lawrence, and they kill a guy and send the boat over the, not the St. Lawrence, it was actually just above Niagara Falls. They send the boat over the Niagara Falls. So this gets kind of ugly, but they have a treaty afterwards, sorts out some stuff going on. People were fighting over timber between New Brunswick and Maine. And there was also some Western boundaries that got ironed out. So that's our last sort of treaty that affects the Northwest that way. And then, so we've talked about all these in their place. And then, so back to our navigable waters. So unfortunately, that term navigable water is not defined. And that is going to end up being a lot of lawsuits going through. The Illinois for whatever reason, they adapt the most, well, probably because they border the Mississippi and the Ohio. And anyway, they decide if it doesn't have regular steamship service, it's not navigable. And, so this is their definition of being navigable. Now, I will let's go back. If you look at this, okay, so this was written originally in 1787. There were 4 steamboats ever built by then, and none of them were commercially viable. So there is no way in the planet the guys who wrote this law intended it to mean steamship travel, because it just wasn't a thing. And another giveaway is this line and the carrying places between the same. So I don't know about you, but portaging one of these would kind of be a pain. But that, interestingly, so the story of the Talisman, it was a 150-ton steamer. So Springfield, this capital, was not on a navigable waterway. So a couple guys decided they were going to force the steamship up the Sangamon. And they literally had a crew out in front cutting tree branches, moving stuff around, and they eventually got it up to Springfield. And one of the guys on that crew was Abe Lincoln. So, and then, okay, a few years later, this is going through his mind. And I don't know if you know this, but Abe Lincoln, the only president to have a patent, and he has patented a device for floating, let's back up, floating a steamboat. So it's kind of hard. We're looking at the profile here, and these are sort of floats that when you get into shoal water, you can force them down and cause a little more buoyancy. And I'm guessing this is a cutout for where the side wheel would be. Now, this whole thing looks pretty ungainly, and it was never put into practice, but he did get a patent for it. But it also means he was thinking about the waterways and how to use them. So now this really restricted view that Illinois has adopted has caused problems. There is this story. Has anybody heard of the Kishwaukee incidents in the 1980s? So there was a farmer, where are we here, who owned this Newburgh, the Shapers, who had this property, and they would build fences across the Kishwaukee River that went down to the bottom of the river and went up about 4 or 5 feet and were reinforced, and they went 20 feet across the river. And if you were paddling down the river, and got stuck there and you tried to get out, he would ride down on horseback with a shotgun and hold you, basically kidnapping you, until the sheriff could come and rescue you. I mean, he was a real son of a bitch. Anyway, and the sad thing is that the Kishwaukee is one of the nicest canoeing rivers, but there in Illinois law, if it's a non-navigable river, you own the whole river, the bottom, the water in it, to the center of the river. And if you happen to own both sides, you own the whole river as it's flowing through. And that's what he was claiming. So there's a court fight because, you know, canoeists don't like being held up by a crazy guy with a shotgun. And during the process, anybody know who this guy is here? Ralph Fries. So Ralph Fries, who had the only canoe shop at the time, and everybody came to him and he rented canoes regularly, and he would always write down where people went when they were renting his canoes. So he goes through his extensive archives and he comes up with every time somebody has rented a canoe and was going to use it on the Kishwaukee River. So they go to court and they show that there is a commercial use of the Kishwaukee River. And oh, I guess it's navigable because somebody's making money on it. So your enjoyment of the Kishwaukee doesn't mean anything. But to pay somebody so you can enjoy the Kishwaukee, that means something. So now the Kishwaukee is open. And if you get a chance, go out there. But I would not go during a weekend in the summer because it's too many people. So it is ruined by its success. Go during the week. It's really nice river. Okay, so now the other sort of big problem that comes up with water rights, the dark green, that's the pineries as they existed in 81 when Sargent did his survey. That's a lot of wood. And as people are settling the Great Plains, they don't have wood. So what makes Chicago is that all this pine gets put into rivers here, dumped into Lake Michigan or somewhere else on the Great Lakes, or it gets boomed and stopped at a mill, and the lumber gets put in a ship, and it goes to Chicago. And this isn't the right picture for it, but these were all lumber docks, and they would load up all these schooners would come in with lumber, they'd unload them, they'd put it on trains, and the trains would go west, and it would build everything. And if you look around, that's the timbers that this building is made of, those big posts. That's all either Michigan or Wisconsin white pine. It was probably 400 to 600 years old when it was cut, and it was floated to a boom and like Saginaw or something like that. It was cut up, put on a ship, and taken out here on the Chicago River. So Wisconsin and Michigan interpret the law differently than in Illinois. It was called the sawn log rule. If a log can float on it, it's navigable. And where Illinois is like, okay, it's got to be year round. It's got to be something that's got the same water volume. The steamship's got to be able to make regular service. This is if a log can float on it at some point. So in spring, hey, it's navigable. And they did that, of course, to protect the lumber industry. But for us today, it means that the best canoeing and the most access is in Wisconsin and Michigan. And it's not because their rivers are necessarily better, but it's because the access is better. But the other side note is the logging companies spent money making those rivers better for their logs to go down without jamming. So they blew out obstructions. They did. So people who go, whitewater rafting on the Wolf River and think they're this great natural experience, well, it's actually a pretty man-made experience, but it's great, but it's all those chutes and everything were actually dynamited through by the logging companies so their logs could get through without jamming. Now, one of the problems if you're doing this logging is you've got to catch the logs at your mill. So you create a boom across the river. I forget, this is probably like the Chippewa, or this might be Beef Slough, which is on the Mississippi, where is it, where the Chippewa comes out? Anyway, these booms obviously did, if you had a steamship, you're not getting through this. And then the other thing all the logs did is 10% of the logs would almost always disappear. And then some of them would reappear the next year and some of them would reappear 10 years later, but they were constantly, some were disappearing underwater and some were coming back. The problem with the ones that were underwater is if one end's down and the other end is pointing where your hull is, it can cause problems. So there's a lot of steamship damage. They're also damming the river in order to flood areas where they can dump their logs in and float them sooner. They're wrecking farmers' fields and stuff. So, of course, that era is over now. But so water rights were handled very differently for a different set of people benefiting. And I think that's it. So the only thing we didn't really touch on was where we went here. Using water for power. So, and we could just talk real briefly. The Fox River has a lot of water power on it, but also where the water power is where there's a big drop. So that wouldn't have been good for navigation. So that was sort of offset. Anyway, if there are any questions. Yeah. How much of the time? Oh, whoa, 8 o'clock. Yes.
Get my.
The eastern states.
Yeah.
So how did like you convince Massachusetts that they didn't have rights to their western territory?
Well, that was at 1780 thing. They agreed that at some point they'd sort it out. And basically it was all of them agreeing that you can't, okay, there's competing claims, but it's impractical for Massachusetts to control a little wedge of the Illinois territory. Right. But see, they were all based on colonial grants given by some guy in London who hadn't set foot, and they knew a couple dozen feet of shoreline on the Atlantic, and they're saying, okay, from here forever. So that's what those are based on, and they realized those weren't real. I mean, except Virginia and Pennsylvania, and they were kind of pushing to get through. So, but yeah, and then the other thing too is I think maybe on some level, because these guys were pretty enlightened, they had just fought a war about trying to control people. You know, they did not like somebody who was out of sight telling them what to do. So I think they realized it would be pretty hypocritical for them to run things, and which is why they wanted the Western states to be states, the Western territories to be their own states. So anybody else? Jim, anybody on? Oh, go ahead.
I'm just checking.
Tell them to get off their duffs and write some questions.
I was going to add to that, so many of the founders, though, did have land claims where they owned thousands of acres past the Appalachians. And so they had an incentive to part with Britain, but also an incentive to settle this as well, because, Washington had already surveyed huge amounts of this territory. Jefferson already had claims in the Ohio Company and the Loyal Company, as you pointed out. So the founders had a stake in settling this, but you see there's some names that remain. Case Western Reserve, that was Connecticut's Western Reserve, so some of the names remain.
Oh, and the other area adjacent to that called the Firelands. That's interesting. The Firelands were to be given to people whose properties were destroyed by the British during the American Revolution. So that's why that area of Ohio is called that.
And the reason Cincinnati is called Cincinnati is the sons of Cincinnati were given land claims that were hereditary. So after fighting war against hereditary succession, the sons of Cincinnati divided that up into claims of 10 and 20,000 acres because Washington couldn't pay them. And their wives are like, honey, you can't come home. We're in debt to everybody we know. And so they settled them out in Ohio with land claims. And so many Patriot officers ended up in Ohio.
But a lot of those land claims people lost because they were inaccessible for so long. So they'd sell them at a loss or sell them for a few bucks. Anybody else? You had your hand up? Well, it is still this it's very restrictive. The Big Vermilion River, which goes alongside Starved Rock, and it flows through that same sort of St. Peter sandstone. So it has a lot of drop. It's a bigger river, so it isn't like going along and suddenly a little waterfall. But so it was a very popular whitewater rafting river. But I'm not sure exactly now, but 5 years ago, the river was completely closed to recreational use because a mining company that was using that, mining that sand decided they didn't want the liability. So, if it's an open navigable river, why is that a liability? But see, that's another thing where Wisconsin, I'm not sure about Michigan, but Wisconsin has laws that go along with this access, in that if you decide to engage in outdoor activities like canoeing or skiing, whatever, you're taking the liability on yourself. So you can't sue a landlord who owns this area on the river that you drown on. So, and it's an understood risk and people assume it. Yeah. Well, that would be what they maintain. Yeah. So, but their definition is based on what they have to maintain by, what contracts they let out and all that. So that wouldn't be that's what they would take a river that's designated as navigable, and they would have to maintain it at that. But that wouldn't be how it got called navigable to begin with. But that is interesting because Bubbly Creek, which is behind us, it's on the maps and on the books. It's drawn as a navigable river, but there's no way it meets navigation standards. It is completely so. Right, but it's still legally, it had been established. Now, what's interesting is every few years they come out with a grandiose plan. They're going to make it a natural river. Which, you can't, because the largest sewage treatment outflow on the planet, when things get bad, they discharge the whole south side into Bubbly Creek. So whatever you do to landscape it and stock it with walleye, it's going to get wiped out every time there's a horrendous storm. They turn exactly. But I think the reason the Army Corps keeps coming up with these plans is that way they can turn it over and it gets off their books as a navigable river. So once that becomes a recreational river, it's not their problem anymore. That's the only reason I can think of they come up with these plans. So, Dave?
Yeah, Bill, you went last wedding on the Zon.
Yeah.
Go down the trip. So remember, Pete won the right that the Luzon River is non-navigable. So he landowner split because people were piling fossils. Remember the trips. So.
Yeah, I just saw that in the news. Was that recently too? That they were the landowner was closed off the river to canoeists.
He passed.
Oh. Okay.
Thing for that. So you have fossil trips collecting them, but he had no report to prevent the fossils on his land.
So for the Chicago River is a navigable waterway, and clearly it is. How does the city of Chicago have the power to force all the sailboats off the yards along the Chicago River and move them down the Calumet?
That was negotiated. So I don't believe it conforms to the original letter of the Northwest Ordinance, if that's what you're asking. No, I mean, yeah, I agree. And I guess Mary Ann's letter to the editor actually had some effect. So they've reduced by a lot how much traffic there is. But really, it's this law. I mean, Chicago's got more bridges than any other city, and all of them are movable. Well, almost all of them are movable, and it's because of the Northwest Ordinance.
They
Yeah,
most-
open, movable, like open, yeah. Yeah, on paper they move, so. Anyone else? Yep, in the back.
To change hands and they built a fence across from the slips, which they don't have the right to do. Because they only own the landowner, one of them. But also they were dumb enough to do it to abut CDOT's property. Who understandably the study found out about it and it turned into a whole thing, but also in the course of doing that, they had cleared out an entire section of trees and eroded the bank like in a week.
Right,
Yeah,
but they had to reverse that.
they did, but I mean. Thing. And so is
Yeah.
policy, as like the deep tunnel system goes in related to, all the stormwater that used to go exclusively go into Bubbly Creek, and now we're trying to balance it out. And then there's Coast Guard jurisdiction and Army Corps jurisdiction as all of this happens. And so this is something that's like it's not 200 years ago. We're dealing with it like every day right here.
Oh, absolutely. But the origins of how it's going to be settled go back to basically this sort of tenet of, English common law, which goes back to Germanic tribal law of, free like the British have free travel. You can walk around Britain, if somebody's got a fence for sheep, you have the right to go around it and walk. So, so a canal, it would be owned by the canal company. So it doesn't fall under an existing river that was the only highway. And that's, and so a canal, can be pretty profitable because you can have existing waterways that don't have a good connection. The canal makes that connection. So there's the use of the whole waterway, but it's being monetized by the canal because that's the point, at which a toll is taken for what they built. But it's owned by them already. So it was ground and then it became their canal. So it falls outside that law. So. Madeline? Oh,
It says, you did not make mention of the system of rectangular land survey west of the quote, point of beginning in Ohio. It is still the basis of most US topographic survey.
yes, the land ordinance. It was a subline on one of the, yeah, it was in that 60 words that people ignored. Yeah, no, that was very important. And the other really important thing, which I didn't get into, is part of that land survey is for every township, a certain amount of that property had to be set aside for public education, which is why you have all these township high schools. Lyons Township, Proviso Township, those are all based on that township survey. And the other thing is all the states had big tracts of land surveyed out that would become the big state universities, which is why they're called the land grant universities. So that's a very good point. But, I could talk a long time about the Northwest Ordinance but thank you for the question. Yeah.
And the goal is to change that definition of that waterways and open things up to paddlers. If you go online to the Illinois Paddler Council, they've got a whole fact sheet about it, but
Great. I would, yeah. Send me that stuff, okay? Yeah. No, we really need that. And but also to go along with that, it would be a lot easier if they adopted Wisconsin's liability laws that so these property owners don't get paranoid that somebody's going to get hurt. I'm not sure, but that is what several of these companies have claimed is the reason they wanted to close off there. So. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Closing ceremony.
I'm just closing everything. Thank you very much to William Derrah for an excellent talk there. Thank you for everyone who joined online.